Great. Hello, everyone, to another webinar with Gable. Today, we're going to talk about beyond square footage, how data-driven leaders are redesigning work. A lot. So excited to kick us off here. And as always, if you're new or if you already know the drill, please, we want to get to know you. Let's get to know each other. Drop in the chat your name, your role, your company, and the location that you are dialing in from. Also, for those of you who don't know who we are, Gable is the workplace operating system. We are a fully integrated solution for seamless hybrid, remote, and in-office management. We have 4 key pillars of our platform: the on-demand co-working, access to thousands of co-working spaces globally for your remote employees on demand, the ability to orchestrate events, whether those are on-sites or off-sites. For companies that do have offices, we have everything related to space management that includes desk reservation, meeting room booking, and finally, visitor management and package delivery. And I am your host today. I am Lisa, the CEO and co-founder of Gable. And with me are incredible speakers. I'll let them introduce themselves. Jeremy, I'll start with you, and Ben, if you can join us then.
Sure. So I'm Jeremy Sales. I lead global workplace solutions now for Marvell Technology. I have about 20 years experience in the industry, half of that time spent on the strategy and planning side, and then half that time spent on the delivery and execution side. I love workplace. I didn't study it in college. I don't know if anybody studies facility. Well, these days, I think some people are studying facilities in college, but I didn't. Just sort of fell into this role. But I really love workplace because of the people I get to work with. I find that they're some of the most caring and empathetic people in the industry, in the professional industry. Most of them more comfortable with being back at the house and providing great service. And those are the people I like spending my time with. So enjoying myself. Nice to meet you.
Awesome.
Ben.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I'm Ben Korn. I'm based in Chicago. I work for ThoughtWorks as the global head of workplace operations and experience. And like Jeremy a little bit, fell into this space as a combination of a bunch of the other pieces of work and things that I was doing. And I think, I kind of really resonate with what you said there, Jeremy, about the people that we find in these kind of functions and these spaces. And, I'm really proud to lead a team of people who, are there to deliver, great experiences and great workplaces for people to make them productive, happy, and be able to do their work.
Incredible. And both of you already said that, it's much more beyond facilities, it's experiences, right? So that's I think part of the common thread that we're going to talk about shortly. Also, we have, after the Q&A, we have also questions from the audience. There are already a lot of questions. So please scan the QR or join us here. You can upvote or add new questions, and we'll run through those questions as long as time permits. So excited to kick this off. Okay, so just a little bit of the context. For decades, workplace planning was pretty simple, I would say, in terms of just the math side of it. Give me your headcount and your personas. I'll split it to square footage. That formula currently is not really working at this point. And today we are planning to discuss this in depth and what are the new metrics or calculations that we should have. So Jeremy, I would love to start with you. You describe yourself as a former cookie cutter workplace person, and you've had an awakening during COVID and everything that comes after that. How did you go from headcount to square footage formulas and understanding that now only 25 to 30% of workflows actually need physical space?
I think we all were. And if you're on this call and you're a workplace industry leader, I think that's how we did it. I mean, prior to the pandemic, go back to 2019 and before, that's what it was. It was, you give me your operating personas, give me an idea of your headcount, how it's going to grow. And then I'll tell you, okay, well, then you're going to need this much square footage. And based on the profiles that you've given me, you're going to need this many meeting rooms, this many desks, this many whatnot. And like, that was just how we did it. And it was more about trying to figure out what the growth was going to look like and how the business was going to change, and balancing supply demand in the portfolio, and then balancing the overall employee experience. So I'm joining Cisco in November of 2019, and Cisco had taken a change in its workplace from the old 8x8 sort of setups into more of a benching standard where everything was sit stand, and it was a lot of open office, some collaboration space, and they designed it with the idea that people were going to be more flexible. And then March comes around 2020 and pandemic sets in and the offices go empty. And I remember thinking, well, this is just going to be a few weeks, maybe a month. Everyone's going to be back, and this is just going to be, normal again. And time kept going by, and the offices remained empty, and people were still working. People were productive, but they were doing it in a very distributed way. And I just didn't think that this was going to stick. But the more I leaned in and the more I started talking to my customers, I started realizing that working in a distributed way was working for them, and it allowed them to do things like manage work-life balance, avoid the commute, which I think a lot of us are still trying to figure out how do we avoid the commute and what we perceive as wasted time in that. But as started to dig in and ask questions about, well, what does your work look like now? The descriptions changed dramatically. Whereas before 2019, work was basically I come to the office, I meet with the people I need to meet with, I do my work, and I go home. Now it's more of a culture of always on, which I'm not sure if that's entirely healthy, but there's a lot of virtual collaboration. The tools are getting better. But those in-person moments are still meaningful, which got me questioning, okay, well then how much of the in-person work is needed in order to maintain the relational fuel and maintain the operating synergies and keep the business going? And through conversations with people, like the 30% number, that's not a magic number. That's just through conversations with people, it seemed to me that if you're a group that's producing a product and you've got 10 or so steps that you've got to do in order to get that product out to the door, more often than not, in conversations that I've had with business unit leaders, 2 to 3 of those things require in-person, real interaction in real physical space. And if you don't do them that way, your product quality suffers. In fact, we recently just did a survey here at Marvell, and I was looking at the data coming in, and our employees are saying about 40 up to 40% of their time is in collaboration. And we considered our company to be mostly like a heads down focused company. So that's new information for us. But then the conversation needed to pivot from, all right, so if 2 to 3 of the 10 things that you need to do to get your product out the door are super important, what do those things look like? Who are you doing them with? What sort of environment is best suited to support the work that's happening in those moments? Because those are the critical moments now. And so instead of designing for all 10 of those things that are happening, what would it look like if we focused on those 2 or 3 things? And how would that shape the workplace going forward? And that's the thought process that I started going through in my journey through the pandemic. And of course, now I'm at a company, and we are a full-time in-office company. We value the in-person collaboration, but there are balances that I think still need to be worked out. And I think we'll get to a little bit of that later.
Thank you, Jeremy. And also, I really love every time that I speak with workplace leaders. I think the way that you treat your employees as customers, right? And like to the point of, okay, what are the key aspects that I need to focus and iterate on? Because like you can do a lot, but like what will actually move the needle? And I think it's also a really interesting point on, we're fully in office, but still there are iteration on how work can be done. And like almost like there is a bit of a clash on like, 40% of work is collaborative, but we are heads down company, right? So it's a very interesting combination to work through. Ben, I wanted to follow up with a question to you. Basically, you built, ThoughtWorks workplace function from scratch, right? And ThoughtWorks is global, over 20 countries. So what's, I would say, the most surprising thing and discovery that you had during this process? And how did it change your approach, if any, to workplace strategy?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think there's lots of things that have surprised me, but sort of for context, ThoughtWorks, yeah, we build software with clients. We're a consultancy, been around for over 30 years, truly global, 40-ish locations in over 20 countries. And if you've ever heard of Agile, we were very key in the beginning of that. Two ThoughtWorkers are signatories to the Agile Manifesto. So if you've been in the software world, that might mean something to you. But it really changed that industry in terms of how software was thought about. It's about being collaborative and iterative, quite decentralized. And as an organization, we were like that. I would say we operated like a kind of company of companies, and the real estate, I guess, was matched that. It was hyper localized for lots of local priorities and local ways of working. So as we kind of started to shift our structure to something more global, our client base was becoming more global. We needed to scale more. We really needed to kind of look at this portfolio and go, what are the best parts of the things that are going on? What's not working? In that time frame, we'd obviously gone through the huge shift of 2020 and 2021, and working models had shifted completely. I think we had a bunch of assumptions around how we worked, like sort of what Jeremy is talking about there. But we really needed to understand as we created this function, how much of that assumption is true? Do we have data? Do we have stories? What do we have to actually, to understand that? And my background is in product management, so that's kind of, I guess, the best question you can ask a product manager is, why should we do this? So I brought a lot of that to it. It was really kind of starting to understand that, what are those use cases? What are those workflows? Why do these sort of spaces exist? And I think the thing that's really, stood out to me is that, I think we can look at this at two levels. There's the broad brush strokes around like, this is how we use an office. But then there's also the nuance underneath that of the kind of cultural element of that. So how people feel about going to an office, about doing work, how they value that is very different in a lot of countries. I think about, before I moved to the US, I was in Australia. People don't like commuting at all there. They do not enjoy that. They do not think that's important. They quite often live closer to offices. Whereas I think about our teams in India, where their daily commute is 2 hours plus normally. But they really value that in-person and shared experience and that connection. So I think that for me, the big thing was to see that diversity in the different ways that people think about workplace and where they do their work and how they do their work. And I think for me, it illuminated, I need to make sure that whatever we put in place and however we think about this, we find the right balance of what needs to be consistent and how we think about it and make decisions. But how do we also not forget and how do we not lose that sort of localized need? As we said, like these people are like our customers. We need to understand them. We need to be able to deliver things that, help them do the work that they need to do. And that goes both sides. It's for the people that are coming, to work every day to do the work that they do that makes the company work. But then also at a higher level, how do we do that from a business stakeholder perspective in terms of the more strategic direction and really balance those things? So I think the thing that I've learned is we're not going to be able to have one data or metric or something that will solve it all, and we've got to get a little bit more granular and really nuanced in these conversations, and also that no one's really worked it out yet because it is nuanced and it is really specific to a lot of the different workplaces that we're in.
I think there's so many interesting pieces in what you said, but one, the localized versus global, right? Like you need to have consistency, but at the end of the day, there are different needs for different cultures. That's very, very true. And we see this with many workplace leaders that talk a lot about that as well, because, there is a big challenge in that at the end of the day, because you need to have, one strategic policy and then some adaptation and being flexible in doing that at scale. So I think it's no small feat to do it as a workplace
Those
leader.
two things don't compute, Liza. Like
Exactly.
being
Yeah,
flexible and
exactly.
doing that at scale, those are going in the wrong
Like, yeah.
direction.
So it's very true, right? Like it's the cookie cutter versus like everything is extremely unique and customized. Like how do you actually do it and what's the right balance there? And Jeremy, this leads to the follow-up question, which is very similar actually in terms of what Ben mentioned, which is a bit of the intersection of art and science in a sense, right? So obviously there is a lot of data-driven decisions that you need to make, and we'll talk a little bit about data later on. But I'm curious from your perspective, how are you balancing, the CEO or the the higher management directive to immediate availability with your belief that is basically we still need room for flexibility. How does it work?
Yeah, look, I get it when leader, oh, I get it and I don't get it. When a leader creates a mandate or asks for their people to come back into the office, it makes sense. I mean, if you're in a fast-paced environment and you are concerned that the work is not happening at the speed it needs to happen, I think a very easy knee-jerk reaction is, okay, well, get everybody in here, all hands to the pump, because we've got to work on this problem. We've got to sort it out. So I think I understand it. I loved what Ben said in terms of there's really not a single metric that captures the moment here, and I think we're all still trying to wade through it and figure out what the future looks like. And there is a lot of tension between the um, sort of unique worker profiles and the customization that needs to be done, particularly on a local versus global context thinking. There's just a lot of work that's still yet to be done in that space. And then there's tension with, yeah, but we need a consistent look and feel. When people step into this office, they need to know that it's our company's office, right? So we have to have these sorts of elements. Um, like there's a lot in your question. I think let me let me focus on the aspect of executive influence and how are we balancing this moment in time. And it's strange for me, right? Because I considered myself a distributed work evangelist for a long time, and I wasn't there in 2020 when this pandemic set in, as I explained. Like I thought that it was just going to end, but once I came to an understanding that actually these patterns that are emerging are showing stickiness and they're gonna stay, had to consider what the future world actually looked like. And as I mentioned, I think there's merit to calling people back into real physical space because those transactions are not replaceable by any virtualized tool. And the tools are getting better. The tools are getting way better. You can collaborate virtually with just about anyone in the world in real time, and you can do it on several different mediums and platforms, and you can be very productive. And I've also heard people say that the 5-minute coffee conversation that I had with them was worth 10 of these video conference 30-minute, hour-long sessions. So there's still no substitute for the substance of an in-person transaction. And it's always going to be that way. I don't think there's going to be any tool that is going to fix that. But how do you balance needing to be in person to move at the speed you want to move at scale with a company like ours with the work-life balance needs of the employee population? And I think right now the mission statement for our company to be the best in terms of processing, storing, and securing data in a data center environment requires the constant attention, the constant iterating, the constant conversations, the constant hallway grabs that are necessary to move the product forward. Makes total sense in our context. But as the business stabilizes and the revenue stabilizes and we start looking at more consistent work product and more consistent work routines, those needs aren't necessarily going to be there. And now you're going to be under threat of competition from other companies with your high talent. You say, what, like, why are you telling me I need to be here 5 days a week when I can go up the road and make just as much? And they're saying I can come in 2 or 3 days. So what I often tell executives is like this moment makes sense for us and it makes sense to our population. Our population has responded. Our customers have responded by coming in and doing great work. But we need to build a plan to get to the future. And I think what that looks like is breaking down a company at its building block level, which is the team unit, not the individual unit. I think a lot of companies have fallen flat with the flexibility notion, trying to individualize it. And that individualizing of flexibility usually comes at the cost of the team work product. But if you break it down at the team level and consider a team the building block of any organization, then each team should know what are those 2 or 3 things we absolutely have to do together in order to be successful. And they can start to build operating agreements around that. And if you do that team by team, now you can start crossing over and building the operating agreements interdepartmentally from team to team. And now you're starting to build up, but you have to build it from the ground up. And then you've got to build it diagonally across the different functions that have operating synergy with one another until you get to a series of operating agreements that then the company can live by and not sacrifice those in-person moments that are so meaningful while still balancing the ability to have a little bit of flexibility in your day-to-day working patterns and routines. So it's a little bit of, building a platform to have your cake and eat it too, ultimately. You don't want to sacrifice the in-person stuff, but you want to give people the ability to, work from home occasionally and make sure that when they do that, it doesn't destroy the work product. I think it's going to be, an 18-month to 2-year journey at this company to build the operating agreements and build the understanding sort of team by team as to what work is necessary to be done. But once a company does that, I think that they're putting themselves in a really good position from a resiliency standpoint. Because now you're no longer reliant on the office to get your work product out. The office is just another tool to get our work product done. And you're using it for the purposes of getting your work product done, not necessarily for everything else that happens on the periphery.
And I really like the context of operating unit, right? Like what's the unit that you need to be operating at? Because part of, what we see is that there's some companies that are mandating specific, RTOs, but, for example, if I'm part of the product team and I'm coming in, my entire product team is actually not in the office that I'm assigned to. Like, what does it really mean for me to come to the office, right? Maybe it's those 5-minute coffee chats that you talked about that, there are research that show that in-person collaboration obviously boosts morale and the feeling of belonging, and it can last up to 6 months. Like that's given. But how do you make that, to your point, as a building block and scalable one? It's a no small task, especially when you are, a mature company. At the end of the day, you need to rebuild yourself. Like that's how it is. And I think that's, again, incredibly hard, but I also think very interesting. As a product person, I'm sure Ben, you can also relate. It's a very interesting problem to solve. Thank you, Jeremy. And Ben, I wanted to follow up with you on it's again this art and science aspect, right? So you mentioned that there is no point in operational processes if we don't think about the experiences, and you both talked about the experience aspect in the role. So how do you really balance that, the spreadsheet side with the human side? And also, especially when people, we see this all the time, are feeling very much attached to an offices that they don't really use. And companies need to also think about efficiency, right? So walk us through that as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like I said, we were a company of companies with lots of, different offices for different reasons, different shapes. So, in building this, this function, it was very much understanding that. And one thing that I kind of have heard recently that I think sums it up is like, if the data and the anecdote are telling you different stories, it's probably the data that's wrong, which sounds like terrible to everyone who always bases it on
everyone's
data.
like, oh,
But I think
okay.
what that for me is saying is that you've got to kind of reach into that data and go, if you were to look at some, data that we had in 2022, it would say, our office utilization was at like 5%. But that didn't actually give us, the anecdotes and what was actually going on the ground. And really what we went about was really understanding, well, what was the purpose of having that space? Why does it exist? And asking that really kind of, I guess, art level question of like, well, what's the reason? What's the purpose? And then we did that amongst, a bunch of the spaces, and the patterns then started to emerge about, well, this is kind of for our collaboration with our clients. So that, there was lots of clients coming visiting in those spaces, which actually wasn't counted in our data. So we got, a bunch of information from those anecdotes that actually started to tell the story. And it was actually that office was very, very utilized for that purpose, but we couldn't see that in the data that
customers, basically.
Right.
That's great. That's amazing. Yeah.
And, as we started to do that, the patterns started to emerge, and that helped us to kind of build a bit of a framework that helps us make decisions about spaces and what we do with them. And, we were very conscious in that to make sure we had the flexibility to, say, well, this doesn't fit the framework, but that became a different conversation. So once we understood the spaces, we could put some kind of like decision-making framework. It then went and said, well, does this space that's coming up for renewal meet this framework of like one of these use cases and these kind of metrics? yes or no, and then we could have the the discussion about maybe if it was a no, well, what's the difference? Why would we still have that space? And that becomes a bit more of a nuanced conversation than just okay, well, we have this many people and therefore we need a space of this big. We actually understand the purpose and we can link that to a business outcome. Maybe that's around talent acquisition. Maybe that's around the speed of delivery. Maybe that's around, how we connect with customers in a specific industry. But we really kind of wanted to make sure we understood that local context after we'd kind of done the spreadsheet activity, I would say, so that we were making good decisions that kind of balance things, and again taking into account that nuance. And yeah, I think some of the things that when we did go through that surprised me were we have some really big emotional attachments to those spaces. So when we started having discussions that, hey, this isn't really something that we need a permanent space for, could we look at other options? People had strong emotional reactions. And the thing that I found really interesting is when you dived into that, it wasn't actually about the space, it was about what the space represented. So for us, that was actually a really interesting challenge as a function to go, well, okay, we don't actually need that space. We need to do what that space represents for our people. So that might have been local traditions about, when they got together and did certain things that just happened to happen in that space. And it kind of came to life a little bit for me in I went to the Backstreet Boys at the Sphere in Vegas recently. And for me, I was like, this is like the ultimate shared experience of a bunch of people, like thousands of people who don't know each other, but they're having this experience together and then forming an emotional attachment to that. And that shared experience in a team or a work situation is what breeds trust. And that leads to the things that Jeremy were talking about productivity and, having the connection, having conversations, because it's on a basis of trust. So for us, it was like, have the spreadsheet conversation. Absolutely, we need to do that. But then when we're going to make decisions based on that, really diving into that human side of like, well, what are we replacing that with? How are we thinking about, those emotional, connections that we need to still have to be a successful business? And, where we are, going to maybe make a decision to transition to a different work model, making sure they stayed in place. Or if we're going to, keep a space, think about that team effort and go, well, how do we design the space with that purpose in mind? Not trying to do all things to all people, but go, this space exists for clients. So how do we design it in a way that makes sense for that? And again, create that right kind of emotional connection to that space.
I love it. By the way, it's a very PM type of role at the end of the day. Like you need to prioritize, right? You need to prioritize what's the North Star metric you're optimizing for that space. And if it's a collaboration, so that's how the space should look like. Or if you're taking away space, like why was it used from the get-go? I think one of the important things, and we see this all the time, is that at the end of the day, like what are you investing when you're closing down offices? Like if you invest more in those experiences that last so long, like I'm sure like I would have loved to be part of that crew going to the Backstreet Boys, but I'm sure it's like an experience for life, right? And it's a very different one than just having a catered lunch to the office. So
Exactly.
it might have cost the same, right? But it's just
and again, that was a big level thing. But
yeah,
you can create those
exactly
shared
that.
experiences everywhere.
I love it. Thank you. And Jeremy, I actually wanted to come back to a point that you talked a little bit before about, what works now for Marvell is very different probably than what will work within 18 to 24 months. And I would love to hear a little bit from you. How do you future-proof moving forward, right? Like how do you build this strategic plan? And I think that's part of evolving, whether you're an early stage company, mid stage company, or a very established one. How do you constantly think about what will keep us competitive later down the line, right?
Yeah, future proofing is, I mean, future resiliency is maybe a better way of thinking about it. The business is dynamic and the business is always going to have risk. Like I think that the answer to that question is know your business deeply and know how it operates. Um, Back to the conversation around, what are the two or three things that need to happen in the physical built environment, or your company's not be successful. You should know what those things are. And if you want your organization to be future proof, if you want your workplace to be future proof, then you've got to know what your company's main play is. Ours is data center engineering. I mean, that we're making a pure play on, so it's easier for me in some respects because we've got a very narrow and sharp focus on what we're trying to do as a company. And so for me, the challenge is what does it take to produce those products? And I have to know it. I have to understand how it works up front from design through testing, through production, through delivering to customer, through aftermarket. I have to know it end to end. And I have to understand not only what the company is producing, but how it's being produced and how the teams are all working together. And only when I arrive at a base level understanding of how all the teams are working together and how the products actually get made and how, basically how the sausage gets made. Once I know that, now I can partner with thought leaders within those functions and we can put a vision together around what is the most optimal way for these things to get done in your segments as you go. So as we get through the nodes in your work product, like what is the most optimal way or an out of the box way, maybe we haven't thought about it before, for doing what you know you need to do. And I think that's how you get on the road towards future proofing or resiliency is fundamentally knowing the steps that your company takes to get its product out the door, and then working deliberately to make each of those steps the most optimal as possible, and leveraging the workplace to do that. And that's really the crux of shifting from a cookie cutter workplace environment to even beyond activity-based working. And activity-based working is great. But I think this is more, intention-based working. Like what is the intention of the moment that we're in, and how is the workplace environment enabling that intention to manifest? I think that's how you got to go.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. And I think I like the future resilience, right? I think that's part of it. And Ben, maybe a follow-up to you as well in terms of, I think we've all experienced, and Jeremy, that's to your point, to the future resilience is like the only constant is change in a sense, right? That's just how life goes, how companies go. And Ben, I know the ThoughtWorks applied like the evolutionary architecture. Basically, you're building in order to be able to change. Can you give some practical advice and examples on how it works and what's, why 5-year leases or long-term leases in general you don't think fit this model anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as an organization, when we're building software, I don't know if you remember the days when you used to buy a piece of software on a CD-ROM, you got it once and that was it. Obviously, that's changed significantly now, where you can be looking at a web page of an app or something and it updates while you're there. So, this idea that business priorities change, the demands of customers, new technologies, the way people work is going to change. Evolutionary architecture in the software world is saying, well, we're going to embrace that. So everything we're going to build is kind of, designed to have change built in, and that we know change is going to happen. So we take that as a consideration and, measure or be able to sort of think about how fit are we at making change happen. So really taking that approach and putting it in the real estate world is saying, well, do we know what it's going to look like in 5 years' time? If we think back now, right, in 2025, August of 2025, what was happening in August of 2020? Would we think we are here based on what we knew then? The answer is probably no. So how do we make sure we build in that flexibility? We think about those models. We think about, okay, well, what if it does change? And, resilience, I think, is a really great word there, because it, is saying like we're protecting ourselves from change by, embracing that change. You can either say, well, we're going to be fixed about that and go, yep, this is what it is. It's just we've got to suck it up. Or we go and say, yeah, it's going to change. So how do we build that in? So, how do we do that from a confidence perspective is pretty much the approach we've taken. The framework that I talked about a little bit earlier, we have the things that meet the framework. And for us, that's the things we have a high degree of confidence in, that, being in that location for that purpose is the right reason. And there's enough data and evidence and, things to back it up. So we're more confident in those decisions. So they're ones we're more likely to commit to, something longer of a lease and potentially have our own physical space, rather than leverage the multitude of options that we have, in front of us. So where we do have, less confidence, it's around, well, how much flexibility do we have to build in? Is it something where we maybe look at taking over a sublease of a shorter period of time, or we want to build in, terms to our, commercial real estate leases that allow us a bit more of that flexibility and understand the kind of opportunity cost that comes with that. Or where what we've done so far is, look at solutions like Gable, like flexible, workspaces that allow us to kind of test and understand what a space or a market or a location would look like before we commit to that, because we don't have the same level of confidence, or maybe we don't have the same level of people. We still want to get them together for those shared experiences, but maybe we've only got 20 or 30 people in a location, not sort of 50 or 100 or something that makes sense. So really it's around how do we have those different levels and layers and opportunities and frameworks, and then how do we bring those kind of, I guess, movements between those. As we get more confidence, then we start committing to those longer term or more solid kind of questions, and really build in that idea of it's going to change. How do we make sure our system and our way of thinking actually aligns with that fact that change is inevitable?
Yeah, I love it. And I think obviously like part of even like testing out different locations, like you will have data, right, to make this
And that's it,
decision.
right?
So it's a bit part of the spreadsheet aspect, but the experience and flexibility combined.
Sure.
I wanted to go to the part of the Q&A. We have so many questions here, and one is, I'm sure, particularly interesting because it was upvoted 6 times. And Ben, Jeremy, please feel free to both answer this. I think it will be really interesting to hear what data metrics you have found most valuable in creating physical workplace that fosters collaboration, sparks creativity, and strengthens culture.
This is a tough one. This is very tough. I think we said earlier that I don't think there is one metric.
Yeah,
but
maybe few.
If you had to hold me to one, I think one that's really interesting is something that balances both sides of that equation. So, if I think about like a cost per visit, you've got the cost side of things around, what's the actual investment you're making there, and then you've got the number of visits. And I think what that has is you've got levers to pull there and to understand is what is driving that cost per visit. Do people like coming to the space and it's just expensive to operate and you've got a lever there to pull? Or is it that you don't have very many visits and it's a high cost and you've got to think about, where that cost sort of thing sits? But I want to freely say that I don't think there's one metric you can pick, but I like that one from being able to balance both sides.
That's my favorite too. And I learned about that one maybe a couple of years ago. I saw it on somebody's a workplace strategy deck, and I was like, what is that? What are you measuring? And why is that important? And started digging into it. It's such a great metric. If you're not tracking it, look at it. Just take your total cost of operating on the numerator and take your total unique daily visits on the denominator. Get your total costs per attendance or cost of attendance. It's a great metric to compare to co-working operations, right? So is your real estate more expensive on a cost per visit basis than it would be to get a day pass at a really nice co-work? And if so, can you explain why? Maybe you've got some really technical infrastructure. You can't get it at a co-work on a day pass, but that's a great metric, Ben. I also, so if outside of that, the next one for me would probably be utilization. And I'll tell you why. And define it first. So, because it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine when people talk about utilization and then using it in the wrong context. So you have occupancy, which if you think about like a hotel, occupancy is how many of the rooms of the total rooms that you've got are rented out for the evening or whatnot. So there's your occupancy. And you got attendance, which is at any given moment, how many people are actually in the hotel. Okay, well, utilization is a product of those two things. And so if you're not defining it the correct way, stop doing that. But utilization, and the reason why is because when we looked at this so I was at Sony Interactive Entertainment for the last 3 years before I came to Marvell Technology. The number one amenity in our office by cited twice as often as any other amenity when people were polled about, hey, what do you like about coming into the office? It was other people. And I think that people continue to be the most attractive part of our offices, the most engaging and most dynamic part of our offices. And that's where our focus should be. So I like that in the cost per attendance or cost per visit, you get both the cost side and the visit side. Utilization should give you an idea of how buzzy your space is, because if you're operating a ghost town, that creates a bad feel. If you're operating, a place there, the utilization is too high. Now you've got a bad situation where people can't breathe, they can't get room to think. So you got to balance that. You need to find as a company what you think your target attendance is going to be, and then you need to rationalize your occupancy against that so that you get to the right range of utilization that feels good for your company. And it's going to feel different company by company, but generally speaking, I think it's going to be somewhere between your 55 and 70% utilization creates enough buzz. And then below that, it's ghost town, and above that, it's uncomfortable.
Thank you, Jeremy. First of all, it's really cool you haven't, talked about this metric before, and you both said, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Atlassian also mentioned that they're using cost per visit, which makes a lot of sense and very much aligned with the hospitality aspect, right, and the people aspect as well. Another question that was mentioned here that was very highly voted is, how do office amenities influence employee engagement? Jeremy, you talked about people, but are there any office amenities? Are there any amenities that leaders thought would be great, but they failed to achieve the goal?
Sort of a concept that's been floating around workplace strategy the past couple of years of like competing against the home. Like we have to beat the home. All right. So you think about the home environment. What's great about the home environment is you have a personalized setup. You have a comfortable living room right next to you. If you're hungry, you go to the kitchen, you get something. If you're thirsty, you go get something. If you need to take a walk, you can do that right in your neighborhood. It's those things that people love about their homes. We have to create a better environment holistically at the office so that people don't feel like they are trading off something more valuable in order to come in. And it kind of goes back to the notion of making the path of least resistance and the correct path be the same path, right? If the office is the absolute best place for me to be to do what it is that I need to do, it's the most comfortable, it's the most enjoy. It gives me, I enjoy being there. I'm the most productive there. I feel satisfied there. If that's the paradigm, then you win, and the employee wins, and the company wins. So I think it's not one particular amenity, Liza, necessarily. It's understanding, and going back to what Ben said about local versus global. It's understanding what makes the home so attractive for people, and what are the elements in people's homes that make working at home so wonderful, and what is the corporate version of that.
Yeah, and I think to kind of add to that is, I think there's a bit of a realization I had that was like, we are like, for a single person sitting at a workspace doing their work, it's unlikely we're going to compete with their personalized setup. And we shouldn't, in our case, we shouldn't. But I think you're right in that the holistic approach to that needs to. And I think that's when it comes to things like, well, do we have the right collaboration spaces, because that's the reason people are coming in together? Are we kind of thinking about how we schedule those shared experiences? Maybe that's lunch, maybe that's an activity, maybe it's something else. Are we scheduling them at a time that makes kind of sense in the scheme of things, and giving people enough notice, those sorts of things? And I think, you can have individual amenities, and that's great, but I think thinking about that whole experience of how easy is it for me to do what I need to do in the space that I'm in. We've been very lucky to open up a few kind of new builds over the last 12 months, and really bringing that, like, well, what does this space need to do? Again, linked to that purpose work I was talking about earlier. In our new Barcelona space, we have these really great team areas where a team can kind of come in together, and they've got collaboration space, desks, sort of like whiteboarding in like a zone where they can almost occupy that for the week or the day or whatever that they're coming in. And again, that's coming from a place of, that's something you can't do at home by yourself. This is something that we want, you're making the effort to come in to work together. And in that location, we had people come in from different parts of Europe, you know, the UK, like other areas. So having a new space and that shared experience was important. And I think, you know, you can have all the flashy amenities and they're like, oh, that's really cool and that's great stuff. But those kind of, can I do the things that I need to really easily in the context of a great experience coming in, is probably the most important. But I will call out that we do have a karaoke machine in our London office, and that's been one of the best amenities we put in. So you do sometimes have to do the fun stuff as well.
Absolutely. I saw a dartboard or two, but I'm not sure that that's the most safe thing in the workplace environment.
Karaoke, I think, is a good one. I'm sure it makes a lot of people laugh and enjoy. That's awesome. Ben, Jeremy, thank you both so much for your time. It was a pleasure. I could have talked with you all day. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our attendees who tuned in. And we'll see you next time in another episode of Gable's webinar. Talk soon and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah.
Bye,
Thanks, Ben.
everyone.